we've got Marcus, who will be giving us a talk about some of the things that we're discussing here, maybe a little bit about his background. Marcus was briefly a student of mine. I think we overlapped one, or it's sort of half a term, right?
Oh, yeah. It might have been a year, actually.
Oh, it might have been a year. All right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Just seemed like a half a term to me. And Marcus has got a fascinating background in connection with what we're doing today, and what he was doing before he was foolish enough to become a priest. So with that, Marcus, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, as Mark says, yeah, our paths crossed in St Michael's College in Llandaff, where Mark was principal. I had happy memories of that year because he was a very good principal. But yeah, before ever I was a Christian, I was an environmentalist, I think, and probably back in my teens when I first became aware of environmental issues, it sort of spoke to me, and I guess that's God calling me through that, through that medium in a way, this sense of justice and and the love of the environment or love of creation. But I wouldn't have interpreted it in that way at all, And I went to university and studied environmental science, which I loved. And but I really distinctly remember when one of the modules taught by a really fascinating lecturer who sort of had all the environmental sort of philosophy at his fingertips, and he taught us about the origins of environmentalism in the world. And there was one bit about Christianity which really stuck in my mind, because I was an atheist at the time, and what he taught was actually Christianity was uniquely responsible for contributing to the environmental crisis. It wasn't unique to him. There's a famous paper written by an American about well, that is American isn't important, but I'm going to go Mark, but Lynn White Jr. and it was a seminal sort of work that sort of pointed the finger of blame at Christianity because it was so anthropomorphic and taught that the world was there for human ends, And at the time, I sort of lapped it up because I was a confirmed and happy atheist, and I thought this is great, another reason to dismiss my this foolish Christianity. But of course, later on, when you sort of revisit some of the themes and look a little deeper, you see that really isn't the case, and actually is it's way wider than the mark. And we'll explore some of that in a minute. And well, I became a Christian after university, and that's another story. But it's interesting to when I look back upon that time and think actually that my environmental studies opened the door to that. Really, I think. It's a sort of complicated path, but definitely the more you look at the environment, the more interconnected you recognize it to be, the more you think it's always there's a bit more going on than you ever quite bargained for. And especially when you take account of sort of quantum realities and the whole universe being somehow related to every other part, I think, gosh, that's pretty big. It's much more complicated than I thought, and it sort of leads you towards a sense of something greater than what's going on before you. I mean, it's another step to become a Christian, isn't it? For different reasons, but it definitely opened the door for me. But anyways, but I became a Christian for much to my surprise and against my better judgment. But God drew me in, but then I ended up then going to work in the environmental field, and other things happened in between, but I ended up working at the Centre for Alternative Technology, which some of you may have been to, up in Machynlleth, sort of an eco centre set up in the 70s, bit of a back to nature commune when it first began, and then it sort of established itself much more as a training sort of centre and a demonstration centre and so on. And when I used to run what was called the biology. Well, I've done different things, but I ended up working 6 years running the biology department, which is a bit of a euphemism for sewage treatment and a bit of conservation. We couldn't think how to combine it, so we called it biology at the time. And so I've got a couple of pictures. I'll just share this for my screen share that. Here we are, right. And put the slides on. There we are, right, okay. I need to, how do I get, there we are, Centre for Alternative Technology in beautiful mid Wales. And I sort of mentioned this because, I did a bit of composting. So quite hands-on environmental work, you know. I did some research into home composting and ran courses. So this is compost toilet building course. Some guys making a compost loo in the woods in one of our conservation areas. And that's another course doing water treatment and sewage treatment. But I just sort of show you those pictures because one of the wonderful things about CAT was that you met all sorts of interesting people, a really sort of lively place. Lots of volunteers would come through, lots of people on courses, and lots of people working there. You know, and they really dedicated their life in service of environmentalism, you know, and protecting the planet. And of course, you'd never hear, very, very rarely hear anyone talk about creation. It was very much a secular institution. But, you know, what was remarkable to me was that the length that the people would go to dedicate their life to caring for the planet and for each other, you know, via the planet in a way, you know, social justice issues. And they put me to shame, I would say, to be honest. I thought, gosh, the changes that people were prepared to make to their lives to live lightly on the earth were really quite radical. I didn't think I quite measured up at times. But one thing I found interesting about this, and also looking back at some of the environmentalists that I studied with at university, was that environmentalism itself doesn't give a very satisfactory code to live by. You know, it doesn't give much reason to be alive, because when you start analysing, you know, what guides human action, very often it's about, well, now we interpret everything in terms of carbon, don't we? And carbon emissions. You know, it's always don't do this, don't do that because it emits carbon. And so there's very little space for you as a person. You know, well, that space can contract, and you can quite easily see yourself as the problem, or humanity as a problem. And of course, some people will talk about that when there's humanity as a sort of plague upon the planet. And actually, the best thing for the earth would be for people to get off it, you know, and not to be there. But of course, that leads to, sometimes these things aren't thought through in any coherent way, but that does sort of lead to these sort of mute feelings of sort of despair in a way that, gosh, I can't do anything helpful except sort of try to back myself into a corner and do as little as possible. And so that's a rather unhappy place for some environmentalists to be in, I think. And so I came to realize that somehow Christianity has got something really valuable to offer the environmental movement. So far from being an enemy of the earth, and we'll look at some of those things, theological reasons why that's not the case in a minute, but also because, as you know, our Christian understanding of who we are, uniquely, made in the image of God, each person sort of a unique creation, and there's something that only we then, as individually created, something that only we can do for God, and only we can do for each other, and only we can do for God's earth. So we're sort of needed, we're necessary. That's a really sort of powerful contribution, I think, that the church can make to affirm people's place in the world. Yes, we cause problems, and we can't always stop doing that just by our very being alive in a way, but that isn't a problem necessarily if we use our time to shape the natural world into a bearer of God's love and peace and justice. That's our calling, and actually we're needed to do that. Oh, there we are. So your planet needs you. I think that's something worth proclaiming to people. And I've got something in the way. Yeah, I mean, if you want a scriptural verse to sort of back that up, I mean, we could look in different places, but St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, when he talks about creation kind of groaning in travail and waiting eagerly for the revealing of the children of God, that this sense actually that the earth is less than it might be, because human beings are less than they might be. And for as long as we resist the call of God upon our lives, and the Spirit of Christ to make us in His own image, then that blocks us from being, from shaping creation into a bearer of God's generosity, which is kind of what we're called to do. So, creation waits for us to play our part as children of God. So, I was going to talk a little bit about. That's not changing picture, but never mind. I was going to talk a little bit about the biblical basis for our, to care for creation, because I sort of mentioned how some people have portrayed Christians as being enemies of the planet, but of course, and of course, some Christians probably are, but really, that isn't a charge you could lay at the feet of Christianity. You could probably trace the roots of the domination of nature back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but probably not much further, and it certainly wasn't. There's no sort of charter to dominate the planet at the heart of Christianity in any way. And when you look back at the biblical record, we see a really different sort of picture emerging. So, if you want to start at the beginning of our Bibles, then we'd look at Genesis, wouldn't we? And what we find there is something rather wonderful. We find that the whole creation that God has made was made good, and it's just a thing of goodness. And that sort of doesn't allow us to separate ourselves from creation. I think God made creation and it's good, and God made us and it's, and we're also good. And when we look at the creation of humanity, or as it's told in Genesis, the story of the creation of Adam, and as you probably know, Adam is a play on words really about earth. Adam from Adama, earth from Adam from human from humus. That's kind of would be a translation of it, and raised up from the earth. We're earth people, and the Spirit of God was breathed into Adam, the same Spirit of God that was hovering over the waters in the big first line of Genesis, and God's agent of creation. So we're bound up with the earth right from the beginning. And there is this line, you see, this the argument that said that Christians are responsible for despoiling the earth, well, Jews as well, was that in Genesis it talks about humans having dominion over creation, if you remember those verses. And dominion can be interpreted as sort of domination, if you want to sort of disparage the Judeo-Christian tradition. But of course, dominion, even in the Old Testament, kings were exhorted to be just and fair and to care for their people. And when you read through the Book of Kings, you can see how pretty much all of them fell short. There's not many that are commended for their actions. But as Christians, if we want to take a model for kingship, leadership, then of course we take Christ. And Christ shows us that to be a leader, to be in charge in the way you serve. That's how the mark of your well, that's the mark of a true leader, is a servant, servant king, and that's what Christ is. So somehow, if you have dominion over creation, what does that mean in the image of Christ? Well, it means we somehow serve creation. We care for it, we love it, we nurture it. Because it's a partner that needs that from us. So a very different sort of picture emerges. All right, I won't trace all of the, there's so many different strands we could pick up thinking about why care for creation in the Bible. And it's fascinating to do so. I think that's one of the wonderful things about this crisis that we find ourselves in, the ecological crisis. But one positive spin-off for us as Christians is to recognise actually that we're faced with this new situation that none of the writers of the Bible really faced or anticipated. But yet Scripture does yield, despite that, it does yield riches for us that are of relevance today, and it's quite, I guess that's a real mark of its inspiration, that we can look back and think, gosh, there is so much in there that speaks to our time, so we find the prophets and the Old Testament often linking the earth and its suffering with humans' disobedience, to the ways of God, and you find that Hosea and Jeremiah and Isaiah often speak of that, and the earth mourns because of human disobedience. I mean, you can't be so simplistic as to turn around and say, well, the prophets were a bunch of environmentalists, because they really weren't. And because if you look to them to give you a solution to the problems, well, what do they suggest we do in the face of an earth mourning and grieving? Well, it's all about right worship in the temple. It's not really about saving the oceans and climate. It doesn't quite bear that. But somehow at a deeper level, there's that recognition that human disobedience causes great trouble for the earth. And the prophets then began to look forward to a day when humanity and the earth that relationship would be restored, to one of mutual benefit. And of course they began to anticipate that would happen through through a Messiah, and one person would be the focus for that. And of course, as Christians, we recognize that that's Christ, and that then Christ brings that reconciliation, not just between people and God, but the wider relationship that was broken between humanity and creation. And we see that, for example, in the story of in Mark's Gospel, where Christ dwells in the wilderness, and it talks about him being with the wild animals, and somehow Christ is at peace with the wild animals. And well, if we look back into the time when those lines were written, it was humanity that was threatened by wild animals, and then our time, it's nature that's threatened by us. But it doesn't matter about that. Actually, either way, Christ brings peace between humanity and nature. That's one of the wonderful rediscoveries, I think, as this environmental crisis forces us to reevaluate the scriptures. And then there's incredible riches in there, aren't there? I mean, and Paul is so explicit really about the link between Christ's reconciliation with humanity, but also for the whole planet. What Christ has done, shedding his blood, brings peace not only with humans, but the whole created order. We find that in Colossians as well. So there's so much we could draw upon and be inspired by. But I think, as I say, if there's one thing to, it's a great pleasure to explore that. But if there's one takeaway, I think, to think about, it's just actually, this is a great gift that Christians offer the wider environmental movement, is it locates humanity at the heart of it and says, yes, you're a problem, but there's no solution without you. And in fact, the world will be better, for your godly actions if you let Christ guide and inspire you. So I probably waffled on a bit there. Just thought I didn't, in my introduction, didn't sort of share with you. So I'm in St David's Diocese here. I've been saddled with the job of Creation Care and Sustainability Officer for the diocese. And there's quite a lot going on, isn't there, at the moment in that regard, with the Church in Wales declaring a climate emergency, which was great back in earlier in the year, and responding to that. And some of the things we're doing here are sure very similar to what's going on with you. So I've decided to sort of focus my action, try to get the diocese to focus on two aspects really. One is EcoChurch, which you've mentioned, and because that's just a fantastic tool for encouraging churches and giving you a sense of direction as to what you might need to do. And the other thing I'm trying to encourage churches to do is to swap energy supplier, and the two things are related, but just to go for that because it's so easy to do. And so, to a supply of 100% renewable energy. So I've been trying to go straight to the treasurers to get them to do that as well, because that gives you this instant carbon reduction, and it's just so easily done. So those two things together are things that I'm trying to encourage. I did have some more pictures, but I can't seem to get my computer to flick through. So I'll leave it there. Happy to take any questions. from anyone on any aspect of that whatsoever.
Thank you, Marcus. And it wasn't a bad picture to be stuck on, so.
No.
Does anybody have any questions for Marcus?
Could I ask you, when you say energy supply, you're referring to the parish buying scheme, are you?
Yeah.
We've done that. I'm in Lanhamlach Church. I just found it just to share the experience. It wasn't easy, and I'm frustrated by the fact that I'm still trying to get them to install a smart meter, having applied for it 10 months ago, and they keep on saying, "Oh well, we may do it next week, or we may do it next month," but it's frustrating because we have to take monthly readings and enter them, and I just wondered what your experience was. I thought parish buying was very helpful, but the scheme is run through Total, and I'm completely convinced it is green, and it is also cheaper. So it's a no-brainer. But
that's good to
just
hear.
find it very, very frustrating.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks for that. I mean, me too, actually, because when I first heard about parish buying a couple of years ago, I tried to log on for our churches here and just couldn't get anywhere with it, to be honest. And I think they're a bit short-staffed. So I just went straight to a company personally and signed up with Good Energy, I think. And a different one actually in the vicarage here. I went for, I forget what it is now, Octopus, I think. But I think parish buying has improved, but it isn't always that easy. So I sort of hesitated to recommend that to people, but I just thought it's the easiest thing to say to them. I was rather hoping that things had improved, but a bit more since I tried a couple of years ago.
Well, just to add to that, the thing about parish buying is that it's a bundle scheme. It's an energy bundle, isn't it? Which is, it's relatively cheap, because there's the bulk buying power of all the Church of England and Church in Wales churches which have signed up to it. So I think that's the reason for hunting with the crowd. So I just am interested that you actually opted out of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a while ago, and someone had suggested it to me, and I wasn't really that aware of it, and I had a go. I thought it doesn't work so well, so I just went alone. But I've been recommended to people.
Yeah, I would certainly recommend it.
Recommend it.
Yeah,
price grounds as well.
Yeah, great.
Good.
Well, look at that. You can kill two birds with one stone. You can be both green and grow in the Christian virtue of patient endurance at the same time.
Well, true.
Any other questions?
Just occurred to me. I'll certainly look into that scheme. For those of you who know All Saints Oystermouth, it's more like a cathedral than a parish church. That was the ambitions of the late lamented Archdeacon Harold Williams. But because of our sort of ancient connections, it's listed. So we've been looking at solar panels, and we're very fortunate that a new member of the congregation did that sort of project for his former parish in Henley-on-Thames. He's discounted using the church at all, despite all the huge amount of roof space we've got because of the listing problems and the lack of sun getting on the roof. So he's looking at the alternative of using our parish rooms, which are nearby but not listed. And he is carrying out regular readings of the meters at the moment to begin to get to grips with it. But it struck me that it's going to be a long job. And it was interesting to hear your sort of feedback there. But parish buying sounds as though it's possibility, so I think I'll look into that as well.
For what it's worth, we went with parish buying for gas, but found that Ecotricity were pretty well exactly the same in terms of the electric price. and Ecotricity have very good green credentials. So it's possibly worth ringing them up and asking for a quote.
Good, thanks, Andy. Yeah.
Great.
Can I just add something as well? All of you obviously are here interested in doing green energy for your churches as well. But for those of you in the Swansea area, and I'm one of those as well, Gower Power, I've got a solar farm in the Dunbant area. And I don't know if you've seen the publicity, but they are looking for 300 homes in the Swansea area. I'm not sure if they've reached the target. I'm sure I've seen something on social media in the last couple of weeks, so maybe they haven't, but they are looking for people to sign up to them, and that is now with Ecotricity as well. So I did it. I was with them before when they were with Bristol Energy. They've gone bankrupt, so now we're back with Ecotricity, but I'm really hoping that that means that our power in this house that I'm in now is being powered from a solar farm in Dunbant. So just, you know, I presume it is only domestic property, so I presume that precludes any of the churches from participating in that. But obviously, you know, in your own homes and if you're in the Swansea area, it's just something to bear in mind and have a look at.
Yeah, just on that same theme, we've just recently heard that there's a local group who've clubbed together to get cheaper electricity as well. So I'm looking into that scheme, whether we can buy into that as well, or instead of what we're doing at the moment. So there may be other local schemes for other people in where they live. So it's worth looking out for things like that.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all. We'll move on to the next thing. Just one thing to add to Marcus's good journey through Scripture. Something that's often overlooked and is well worth praying is Psalm 104, which lays out sort of God as creator and in relation to creation, and it's a wonderful vision of what the Bible intends as its ideal of all of creation living in harmony with each other and with its creator. So it's a wonderful psalm if you've not really stopped to dwell on it.